Hi everyone, my name is Aitana and I'm going to be presenting my pathogen presentation on Ascaris lumbricoides. Ascaris lumbricoides is a type of intestinal roundworm that infects humans. I chose this pathogen because I actually remember learning about it in my plant and animal biology class, and it really stuck with me because I thought it was super interesting, but also kind of scary that something like this can grow so large inside a person and that people can have no idea that they're even infected. I also wanted to explore this specific pathogen because as a public health major, I care about understanding diseases that are a big problem in underserved communities, and even though Ascaris is rare in the US, it's still very common in places with poor sanitation and limited healthcare access. So let's start with the classification of Ascaris lumbricoides. The domain is Eukarya, the phylum is Nematoda, the class is Cesarnantia, the order is Ascaridida, the genus is Ascaris, and the species is Ascaris lumbricoides. The phylum Nematoda is really huge. It includes over 15,000 species. As we learned in class, many of these species are actually human parasites. One important thing we learned was that these roundworms use human and animals as living reservoirs. This is found in Chapter 5. I also wanted to quickly talk about the class Cesarnantia, which is known for having nematodes that usually have specialized excretory systems and often include parasitic species. A lot of the roundworms that infect humans and animals come from this group. Within Cesarnantia, Ascaris belongs to the order Ascaridida, which is mainly made up of large intestinal worms that tend to infect vertebrates like humans, dogs, and cats. It's interesting because the genus Ascaris includes other species too, like Ascaris sum, which primarily infects pigs but can also sometimes infect humans. This just shows how parasites in this genus are closely related and can sometimes even cross over between different species. Ascaris lumbricoides is actually one of the largest intestinal parasites that can infect humans. Females can grow up to 35 centimeters long, and males grow up to 30 centimeters long and also have a curved tail. The worm's body is smooth, cylindrical, and tapered at the ends. But what makes especially important for diagnosis are the eggs. The eggs are microscopic and have a thick, bumpy shell that makes them super resistant to harsh environments. Under the microscope, the eggs are oval-shaped and have a unique surface that's often used to identify them in stool samples. Ascaris primarily uses anaerobic respiration because it lives in the low oxygen environment of the intestines. This relates to what we learned in Chapter 8 about cellular respiration. This is super important because it explains why the worm can survive where oxygen is scarce. The disease caused by this worm is called ascariasis. It's actually pretty common in developing countries due to the lack of sanitation and access to clean food. A lot of people with mild infections don't show any symptoms, which connects to what we learned about asymptomatic carriers in Chapter 16. These people can spread the eggs in their feces without even knowing they're infected. In more severe cases, the symptoms include abdominal pain, nausea, vomiting, coughing, breathing problems, and sometimes people can actually see the worms in their stool. One of the most dangerous complications is when a person has so many worms that they block the intestines or migrate to the lungs, which can become a medical emergency. So how does Ascaris lumbricoides spread? It is mainly spread through the fecal-oral route. The eggs leave the body in human feces and contaminate the soil. These eggs can survive in soil for years, which is a great example of non-living reservoir that we learned about in Chapter 16. When people eat food or drink water that's contaminated with these eggs, or when kids play in contaminated soil and put their hands in their mouths, they can easily get infected. This is an example of vehicle transmission and indirect contact transmission. The people most at risk are those living in areas with poor sanitation and children who play in contaminated soil. It is most common in places with warm, moist climates like parts of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Doctors usually diagnose ascariasis by examining stool samples under a microscope to find the characteristic eggs. Sometimes they may use imaging like X-rays if they suspect a large number of worms. For treatment, albendazole and mebendazole are the most common drugs. These are antihelminthic drugs that we learned about in Chapter 14. They work by blocking microtubule formation in the worm's intestinal cells, which stops the worm from absorbing glucose. This starves the worm and eventually kills it. We also talked in class about how it's hard to make drugs with selective toxicity against helminths because they are eukaryotic like us. So finding drugs that can target the worm without harming the human host is a challenge, which is why these antihelminthic drugs are so valuable. As for prevention, it's mainly about proper sanitation, washing hands, and cooking food properly to avoid ingesting eggs. Here are 2 questions I came up with for us to think about as a class. The first one is, why do you think this parasite is still so common today, even though it's preventable with basic sanitation? And the second question is, how could global climate change impact the spread and survival of Ascaris lumbricoides eggs in soil? Here are some of the references I used to get my information. That includes the CDC website, the WHO, Mayo Clinic, and our OpenStax microbiology book from class. Thank you for listening to my presentation. Good luck with finals.